Okay, back to Luban, more about his points. Here is his first main point about torture. He says, when we talk about torture in the contemporary day, and this was definitely true right after September 11th, and based on a lot of your responses to the question I just asked, we'll see that it's still the way people think now, okay, more than a decade after September 11th. A lot of people, when asked about torture, or when torture comes up, they think or discuss a scenario in which there's a bomb about to go off in a large American city. It's planted by terrorists, so, evil people. These aren't, freedom fighters or anything. They're evil people. You've got one of them in custody, okay? You've got one of these evil people in custody. And this person knows where the bomb is, knows how to defuse it. You've tried other things, but you can't get any information from them. But you know that if you torture them, then they will give you the information. That information will come in time. And so you will be able to prevent the deaths of many innocent Americans. You only have to do this one thing. Okay, and we all know the people involved in these decisions would be anguished. They wouldn't want to torture. But being forced into this situation by Al-Qaeda, they have to make this painful decision of whether to do this or not. Now, you can all imagine that kind of scenario, right? In fact, you can probably, because we've all thought about it or talked about it before, you can probably even picture it in your head, right? And what Luban would say is, yeah, you can picture it in your head. In fact, doesn't the guy who is going to have to do the torture, doesn't it look like Kiefer Sutherland in your head? Yeah, because, I'm sort of, maybe not literally, but I'll explain what I mean. Kiefer Sutherland was in this long-running TV show called 24, right? And basically it was him against the terrorists, and he had to use unorthodox methods to prevent the terrorists from blowing up American cities. And in fact, at one point in the series, he does, if I'm not mistaken, torture someone. I think one of the things he does is he has a recording that makes it look like they're killing the daughter of one of the suspects, and that makes the suspect crack and give up the information. So Luban's point is this. He says, what we have in our heads when we think about torturing terrorist suspects to get information which would prevent casualties, we have in our head what he calls the ticking time bomb scenario. That's where the title of the article comes from. Okay, there's a ticking bomb. You've got someone who can basically stop the bomb. The only way to get their help for stopping the bomb is to torture information out of them. It's just one person you have to torture. You don't want to. There's lots of American lives at stake, and you know it, and all these puzzle pieces fit together. His point is, he says, that's what he calls a bewitching picture. It distorts the reality of what terrorism and information collection actually is. The point is that you've seen that scenario play out a bunch of times in movies, but you will only ever find terrorism and torture working that way in movies. In real life, it doesn't ever work that way. So remember, the basic question is, under what circumstances would you allow the United States government to torture? And many Americans will say, under almost no circumstances would I allow the government to torture. But they say, well, I've got a scenario I can think of. If there's a bomb about to go off, if it's in a large American city, if we have a person in custody right now, if we know that that person in custody knows something about the plot, if we know that we can disrupt the plot in time, and if we know that we can only do that through torturing. But do you see how many ifs there are there? The scenario has to be perfect, like they are in movies, for it to be bad enough for many Americans to justify torture. What if you've got someone in custody, but you don't know what they know? Now, by definition, when you are interrogating someone, you don't know what they know. You see what I mean? Because if you knew what they knew, you'd already know it. and you wouldn't be trying to get them to say it. Right? If you knew the bomb was on 3rd Avenue and 26th Street, you don't need to torture them to get that information. Here's another thing that is how it doesn't really happen in the real world. Often it's not that you have one person who you know has information about the plot. You've got a number of people who may know something about the plot. But they may know something they might not. They also may know something that's about the plot, who made the bomb, for instance, or what kinds of chemicals are in the bomb. That could be useful for disrupting the bomb. But they don't know where it is. So again, if all the pieces were in place that this scenario conjures up, this bewitching picture of the ticking time bomb, then Luban says he can sort of sympathize with people who would say, under those circumstances, I would allow torture. His point, though, is that if for you a situation like that allows torture and other situations don't, that situation never actually happens in real life. It's a movie scenario, not a real life scenario. Our brave women and men in the military do not come across that situation ever. Only actors in movies come across that situation. So what that means is if that situation is the sole time that you would allow torture, then you don't actually want the United States government torturing because they never run up against that exact scenario. Okay? Now, many people will respond and go, okay, I was just thinking of sort of an ideal scenario. That's why it looks like a movie. But if most of those conditions were met, I would allow torture. But think about what it means if some of those conditions are met and not others. It means you have one or many people in custody who may or may not know something about a plot that may or may not exist. Torturing them may or may not get you the information you need. And they may or may not tell you the truth when tortured. So then what you're saying is you're willing to torture on the off chance that it might prevent some American casualties. And you're willing to torture multiple people, including people who may not know anything. So on page 412b near the bottom, his point is this. He says, torture has uncertain results. In the real world, the results, what you'll get out of torturing, are uncertain. The person may or may not know anything. So you might torture someone who doesn't know anything. They might know old information that's no longer useful. So you might torture someone who's a very bad person, but get useless, non-actionable intelligence out of them. Okay? They may know one piece of the puzzle, but not enough. So then you have to torture other people. But then it's uncertain how many people do you torture, which is a point we'll get into in a second. So Luban's point is that the results of torture are uncertain. You may or may not achieve your goal. But one thing is certain about torture. You and your government become torturers. So whether you gain anything or not from torture is, who knows? But you do know that once you go down that path, your nation has that sort of stain or has lost the moral high ground, where now you'll do the sort of wretched things that you thought only happened in other countries. So that's the first main point. And Luban goes on to point out an instance where torture definitely worked and prevented a plot to blow up an airliner, right? And he goes to show that in the real world, all those conditions that we would hope would be present that would make it morally okay to torture, they weren't there. They almost tortured the guy to death before he gave up any information. They had him in custody knowing he was part of a terrorist organization, but not knowing that he had any information about this plot. They didn't know there was a plot until they tortured him. Okay. But a totally legitimate response to that is say, but it worked. It worked. A real situation, and it worked. So I'd just say look closely at that situation there. This is page 411, the second column. And he's saying that's what the real life situations look at. And some of you will look at that and go, yeah, messy, but whoever said torture was nice. And some of you will say, whoa, I didn't authorize the government to do that kind of stuff in that kind of situation. I don't want them doing that in my name. Okay. So before we go on to the second point, I have a question for you all. We should have defined torture from the very beginning, right? I'll say this to you when you write papers, etc. I'll say, hey, you have to define the key terms. If you're going to ask if capital punishment is acceptable or abortion, you have to define what those are, right? If you want to say, how do we fix income inequality in the U.S.? Well, you have to define what you mean by income inequality and what would count as a fix. So the question I want to ask to you is, what actually is torture? Whether you think it's morally acceptable sometimes or not. What's torture? Does it have to be physical? Does it have to leave permanent effects on the person? Does it have to be cruelly motivated by the person doing it? Or is it more about how the other person experiences it? For something to count as torture, does it have to violate rights? And if so, then, prisoners don't have a right to be free from pain, for instance. So if it's just pain, does lots of pain violate your rights? Maybe yes, maybe no. So basically we want to know that when we call something torture, which to some people is always unacceptable, and to others is acceptable only under certain rare circumstances, we darn well better know what we're authorizing and what we're not authorizing. So we have to define what torture is. So this is an important question because today there's lots of things called torture light, which Luban briefly mentions. And these would be things like, again, everyone's definition is different, but some people would call things like sleep deprivation, torture light. Some people would call waterboarding, since it doesn't actually hurt the person, torture light, or would not count it as torture. There are things like blaring loud music, like heavy metal music for days on end to disorient people. Okay, clearly that's not very nice, right? But lots of things aren't nice. It doesn't make them all torture. So we want to know what sort of things. Does it have to be physical pain? Can it be mental pain? How bad does it have to be? Does the motivation have to be to hurt the person? Or if the motivation's good, does it somehow stop being torture, right? Should there be different definitions of what's torture for citizens and non-citizens, etc.? Okay, so once more, Luban's first main point is that the most common justification of when torture would be acceptable is a fantasy or a fiction that doesn't actually happen. So it just confuses us about what torture actually is, and it basically works like this. If I ask you, hey, is lying right or wrong? And you say, well, it's wrong, but what if you got Anne Frank in your attic and Hitler himself comes to your front door and says, is Anne Frank here? If she is, I'm going to kill her. If not, though, I'll go on my merry way and you have a nice day. People go, well, what about that situation? Would it be wrong to lie in that situation? Well, that's sort of a backwards way to answer the question, right? Because that's not something that's really going to happen. Now, you could ask a different question that's more realistic, but that one, right, that should not be your guide to whether you should lie to people or not. Is this imaginary run-in with Hitler? Okay? If there's going to be a way to justify torture, it's going to have to be something more realistic than, would you torture Hitler for 20 seconds to prevent the Holocaust or something? Yeah, okay, I think we'd all do that. But if you do that, that's very different than torturing a chauffeur who might know something about a contact that Al-Qaeda uses, right? They're different scenarios. The second major point he makes is this. And I always like to say, just to sum this one up, it's basically anti-utilitarian. That's one way to think about it. Remember, utility from earlier in the semester says that All actions should be guided by calculating the total amount of pains and pleasures caused by the act. Okay, and if it hurts more people than it helps overall, or it hurts some way more intensely than the benefits that other people accrue. So if you hurt one person like on a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, and you benefit two other people just a little bit, like +1, right? Well, you've done a lot more hurt, even though it's to only one person, than you've done benefits to those two others. Basically, it's like a cost-benefit analysis. Whoever receives the costs, whoever receives the benefits isn't the problem. It's just whether it's overall profitable or not. Overall, does it cause more pleasure, or in this case, does it prevent more pain than it costs? Okay. What Luban points out here, though, is that when you crunch the numbers for moral situations, you end up authorizing some pretty creepy things because it all just comes down to how the numbers boil out. All right? Right? And so you can take the points he makes here to reveal something about utilitarianism in general, but he's definitely using them to talk about torture specifically. Okay? So these are on page 412. Okay? So he says, you know there's a bomb plot about to happen, and you've captured someone who may know something about it but might not. Do you torture him or not? Okay? Here's where it gets into being about the numbers. How much do you torture him? For weeks? For months? If he doesn't talk, does it mean that you should increase the amount of pain you inflict on him in case he knows something? Or should you reduce it because you're probably not going to get any profit that is saved lives out of it in the end? What do the odds have to be? So you've got someone, you think he's in ISIS, but you're not sure. Or you know he's in ISIS, but he's a new recruit. Probably not giving him bomb information just yet, right? Okay, if he's a new recruit, let's say his odds are about 1 in 10 that he knows something about an attack against Americans. Because remember, ISIS is in Syria, Iraq, a few other places like Lebanon, I believe, but they're not in the U.S. They're not actively plotting in the U.S. That we know of very often. So you've got a recruit. He's fresh off the battlefield in Syria. You captured him in Syria. We'll say Iraq because there's more Americans in Iraq. You capture him in Iraq. You know he's in Syria, in ISIS. He says, yeah, I'm in ISIS. I hate America. Okay, so he's a bad guy. But bad guys don't always know about terrorist plots. So let's say the odds are 1 in 10 that he knows something about an active terrorist plot against Americans. If all you have are odds, how do you know how to proceed? What if you have a group of people who you know are terrorist plotters, right? And there's 10 of them. But they're doing small scale stuff, like they're putting pipe bombs, not mega bombs, but just small bombs that might kill 1 or 2 people. Would you torture all 10 on the chance that you might save 2 American lives? So part of Luban's point here is that it's not clear how you would even get accurate numbers in the first place. Like I said, this is a point you can make generally about utilitarianism. You don't know how to predict the future well enough to actually calculate things in terms of probabilities, chances, etc. Like if you've got someone who says they're in Al-Qaeda, I think you can believe they're in Al-Qaeda. But is there like a standard formula for calculating sworn allegiance to Al-Qaeda equals blank percent knowledge or blank percent chance they know about a plot against America? Remember, it's not like there aren't daily briefings for everyone in Al-Qaeda about every operational detail of a terrorist plot. Another point that he makes is that when you do this, you want to realize that what you're doing is you're treating human lives as if they're just numbers that can be weighed up against each other. So you're treating the terrorism suspect as just a probability or an odds that you can sort of exchange for the profit of saving American lives. Now, that doesn't bother some people. They say, well, this person's an avowed terrorist. I don't care if I treat them like a number. I could treat them a lot worse. But remember, you're also using American lives the same way. That if this person poses little enough of a risk to Americans, the numbers shrink. Then Americans just become part of this calculation as well. Now, as I said, that also doesn't bother some people. Because they say, well, I'm trying to save their lives. So if I have to treat them as a number in order to protect them, that's not really dehumanizing. But you do have to remember, we're talking about something that we take so seriously, protecting American lives, and talking about another thing that we really don't want to do, torturing people. You know, we're talking about pulling out fingernails here, making them feel like they're drowning, sleep depriving them until they start to go a little bit crazy. These are not things anyone enjoys doing. And so then if you just sort of set up a formula, add some numbers in, crunch the numbers. If it's 49%, we don't torture. If it's 51%, we torture. That seems like a very strange way to approach such a serious moral topic. Okay. And here's another way to think about it. Once more, this is about utility in general, a point I'm trying to make, and then about torturing specifically, what Luban's trying to make. He says, when you say that to prevent something very bad, you will do other things which are bad, but not quite as bad, you're authorizing yourself to do almost anything. Right? So again, nobody wants to torture, but they're saying, hey, if there's American innocent lives on the line, I will do anything. I mean anything to protect them. Now, at one level, that's totally noble. That's actually bravery, right? That someone would be willing to do something like torture, which horrifies them, in order to save other people. That's actually a big sacrifice and a burden for that person to take on. But if you're saying that literally you're willing to do anything to protect, say, 3,000 or 4,000 American lives on September 11th, then you're saying you're willing to do anything that's not quite as bad. Anything including, if it came to it, killing, say, 2,000 innocent civilians somewhere else. If that's what it took to save 3,000 or 4,000 American civilians here, you're saying, a utilitarian would say, I'm willing to do it because it's bad, but it's not as bad. That's a pretty dark path to head down, right? Partly what it means is that you'll do anything. That already starts to sound possibly immoral because you're throwing out all rules. Second, think about it this way. What if Al-Qaeda and ISIS get stronger and start escalating the fight against Americans? Do you really want to turn into somebody that acts like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to prevent something like Al-Qaeda and ISIS? So part of the examples that Luban gives are this, is once you've authorized that you'll do anything so long as it's not quite as bad as what you're trying to prevent, why don't we torture the family members of known terrorist suspects in front of the terrorists? Because that might get them to crack, right? Why don't we take the family member of the torture suspects and threaten them or torture them? Because remember, you're not saying I have rules set in advance. You say, I'll do whatever it takes to prevent another September 11th. In Russia, they do this. They bulldoze the houses of family members of terrorist suspects. And I think they may do that in Israel as well. But if you want to know more about this, I'd Google it. Okay? But in some places, they fine or threaten or otherwise punish family members. Now, when those family members are innocent, say, like an 8-year-old girl, probably not a member of Al-Qaeda, okay? Some people say that person's innocent. Other people say, hey, we've got to squeeze the family. So Luban's point is that you've authorized yourself to do all sorts of creepy and strange things. Many people would respond and say, that's the only way to prevent something even worse from happening If that's what we have to do, then we literally have to do it. Okay. Another point that Luban makes in this section, but it's separate from the numbers utility point I want to make. I just want to point it out though. It's page 412b near the top. It says, if torture is legitimate in circumstances where it would prevent a large loss of civilian life, then presumably it would have been legitimate for the British, say, to torture German members of the German military in World War II because Berlin was bombing London at night, the siege of London, for a long time, and civilians were getting killed on the regular. And it was indiscriminate bombing. The Nazis would just drop bombs in busy civilian areas. They weren't trying to get military targets. So great loss of civilian life, that would have authorized the British to torture the Nazis. Once more, some people here go, yeah, they're Nazis, torture away. But remember, in World War II, we dropped nuclear bombs on Japan, on civilian centers, also not trying to hit military targets, trying to end the war. Now, our logic was that we're going to save many American soldiers' lives, not civilians, but soldiers. We're going to kill lots of civilian Japanese, but we'd kill them if we went in with normal services anyhow, accidentally. But you roll tanks through Tokyo, you're going to accidentally kill civilians too. We'll probably save more lives overall if we kill them. But you have to see, if your moral reason applies to one group of people in one situation, the British against the Nazis, it applies to other groups in similar situations. It seems that would authorize the Japanese military in World War II. And remember, they're allied with the Nazis. It would authorize them to torture American military members if doing so could have prevented the nuclear bombs from going off in Japan. That's how moral justification works. If situation X allows people Y to do action Z, then it's also going to allow, in a similar situation, people A, a different people, to do action like action Z, because the rules are the same. The point is, if we're allowed to torture terrorists to prevent them from killing Americans, it seems that other countries are allowed to torture Americans in order to prevent our military from killing them. If it's about protecting life, and you can do anything you want in order to protect life, it seems that American service members are subject to torture if they might know something, which a lot of them do, in fact, know something. I don't want other countries using this logic against our Air Force, Marines, Navy, Army, etc. Like I said, that's not really, it's in the section about numbers and utility, but it's really a separate point. Okay, beginning on 413, going through the end, we have the points on what Luban calls torture as a practice. Okay, so the first major point was about we want to think realistically about what torture is, not this daydream about ticking time bombs. The second one is about if one authorizes torture, it's really hard to figure out who to torture, when, how long, what options are on the table. And I like to think of that for our classes as helping us think about utility as well. This third point is just totally concrete, totally practical. It's that if you're going to torture, you're going to have people trained as torturers. If you're going to authorize torture in some circumstances and not others, you're going to need someone, military, a judge, an elected official, someone deciding which circumstances warrant torture and which ones don't. That is, torture is not something that's going to happen just one time. Military members in the field and they randomly run across Osama bin Laden. That's not how it works. It's that you've got teams trained to go and capture people and bring them back for detention and interrogation. You've got psychologists who are trained in how to break people down. You've got doctors who take the oath, first do no harm, trying to figure out the most painful ways to expose people to these tortures to make them crack. So Luban's point here is that if you're going to authorize the United States to torture, you're not authorizing one guy one time to torture one known bad person. You're going to have to build up a whole big section of America whose job it is to torture. So he says, you have to understand how the military works. The military is a bureaucracy. It's a giant administrative machine. So for things like new tanks, they have trade shows in Las Vegas. And you can come if you make military weaponry. So if you're German, Israeli, French, these are big weapons manufacturers. They come to Las Vegas. They try to sell the newest weapons to Americans. And that's just part of how the military sources its weaponry. We build some ourselves, we buy some, or get researchers, etc., from other places. If torture was built in and established as just another part of military practice, you're going to have trade shows in Las Vegas where representatives come from around the world and say, no, my waterboarding technique is the best. Hire me, buy my book about how to torture people. You're going to commodify torture. A simpler way, if you're not clear on how these arms trade fairs work, is this, is that in the military, everyone has a job. You don't just have soldiers who go out on missions. You got one person, all they do is munitions. You got another person who's about transportation, logistics, etc. And they're trained in that. Because the U.S. military is the best military in the world. You don't get the best military in the world just by throwing people out into the field. You train them for years in what they specialize in. So if we want torturing to be effective, and there's no point in torturing if it's ineffective, then we have to train people. That is their job and their specialty. Not munitions, but torture. So that means there will be Americans who might be your neighbors, who might have children, whose job, what they drill day in and day out in the military, is how to effectively break people down. How to take a human being and erase all resistance in them. There's two things. One, do you want to live next door to someone whose job it is not, how to move food from one part of a military operation to another, but whose job it is to capture people and make them say things they don't want to say. Whose job is how to pull out the fingernails in the most painful way possible. So do you personally want to have that kind of person around in American society? Second point is this. Are you willing to ask that of people in the military? That's going to damage the person whose job it is to do that. So in the U.S. right now, there's a really big disconnect. It's very sad, but there's a very big disconnect between the people who go into military service and those who don't. So the burdens placed on people who go into the military are known completely by those in the military. Because they suffer. They move their families every few years. They deploy overseas for years at a time. They die. They see their friends die. They come back with post-traumatic stress disorder. So we ask a lot of our American military. And since so few Americans go into the military now, it's only about 1% of the population, those who go know and suffer. Those who don't go into the military don't know the burdens we place on them and don't suffer. So do you really want to pile one more thing on this heavy burden that American service members have to go, where some of them come back from post-traumatic stress because they've seen friends lose arms and legs? Do you want extra ones coming back with post-traumatic stress because they had to torture people? I think I'd have nightmares at night if I tortured people, even if all of them were guilty and even if the information I got out of them was highly useful. Because those are terrible things to do and see, even if they're good overall. So do you really want to burden someone that you've never met with this extra burden? Okay, and final point I'd like to make about this is still the culture torture, the torture as a practice point, this third main point, is that the way bureaucracies work, the way ranks and orders work, is basically that the higher ups make rules, and if the people lower down on the totem pole follow those rules, they get rewarded, and if the people down the totem pole violate those rules, they get punished. But it's never the CEO, right, who loses their job when a policy fails. It's some mid-level manager who loses their job when the policy that the higher up authorized fails. So, for instance, in the past, when the United States military has gone further than it was legally authorized, when it did immoral things, like Abu Ghraib, where there were prisoners who were sexually humiliated, and we took pictures of them in weird situations to embarrass them, right? We attacked them with dogs because a lot of Muslims think that dogs are very unclean and they don't want to be around dogs. So sort of a psychological torture. Well, when we decided that was that broke a bunch of rules, right? It was only the low-level people who got in trouble for that. The higher-up people who knew it was happening, who allowed it to happen, don't ever get punished. So that's one aspect of the bureaucratic nature of the actual practice or culture of these institutions, right? Another thing is this, is once you have a rule in place, you can do, say, sleep deprivation, but you can't hit the subjects. You have a rule in place that allows some kinds of torture or abuse, you shouldn't call it abuse, torture or inflicting of pain on the subjects. What inevitably happens is someone goes a little bit further. So if they're allowed to use sleep deprivation but not psychological tricks, when they're using sleep deprivation and they think the person knows something, they're always going to be tempted to go a little bit further. So basically, it's sort of the point here is it's a Pandora's box. If you have an institution that just says, no, we don't torture ever. We don't use torture light. We don't torture some people and not others. We just don't ever torture. Then everyone in the institution knows they can't torture. But if you have a rule book which is constantly changing, being revised by Congress, might be different for the Marines than it is for the Army. Yeah, you can torture, but don't use this kind of torture. You can do this, but only do it under these circumstances. It's really confusing for the people involved. And inevitably, someone's going to go too far, whether just because you've confused them, or because they, this time, want to go a little further than the rules. And so you basically opened yourself up to people constantly going too far and transgressing the rules you've laid down. Wouldn't it be simpler to just say, we're not training anyone in torture. We've got no trade shows. We're not going to punish the lower level people for mistakes and let the higher level people off. We're just going to say, like we used to, the United States does not torture, even the worst, under any circumstances. We can defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda militarily without torture, and that's how we're going to do it. So as I said, I want you to see that he makes three very different kinds of points there. You can find all of them incorrect, some of them correct, right? And you can treat them all differently. Okay, and with that, that's our reading on torture from Luban. If you have any questions about this or anything else in the class, you can always shoot me an email. And thank you very much. Bye.